Hey, so it's time for part 2 of E.T.A. Hoffmann's 200-year-old tale, The Sandman. I've been doing a little reading tonight, trying out Paradox Bound by Peter Clines. So far, a fun little bit of time travel. Also been thumbing through a classic and useful tome, which I highly recommend. And in the morning, you can hear a bit more of The Wise Woman or the Lost Princess from me by George MacDonald. And what else? Oh, you know, tomorrow morning, my newly compiled YouTube collection of the live streams of William Hope Hodgson's House on the Borderland will go live. Look for those links on Facebook. Let's see. Where were we? Perhaps we'll let the sirens pass. That'd be interesting if I sat here and forgot to read aloud. Right? I like to have the books in the shot. And I like not to be quite that diagonal in orientation. Hey, who knows? Can we try the tag friends thing again? Well, Facebook says yes. I'm stunned. I'm absolutely stunned. That means I may actually have company tonight? What a swell idea. The idea that I might have company while reading. Oh, Facebook. Oh, you are too kind. All right, so I am tagging some friends here, and we're going to get back into The Sandman, which is a tale almost as old as the oldest house I've ever lived in. It's 200 years old, and hey, I lived in a 205-year-old house on the south side of Pittsburgh for a few years. Well, longer than I've lived anywhere else in my life, 9 years. Anywho, it's a 200-year-old tale. It's a translation. From the German, E.T.A. Hoffmann. And it feels oddly contemporary to my ears. All right, I'm not going to take much more time doing this. Seeing some folks that I know like to know when this is happening. And I'm trying to nab them. Almost there. So thanks for coming around at 10 p.m. for our weirding hour. Good fun, I promise you. And we're going to get into the tale here in a minute. I am just tagging a few folks, because it's nice not to do this alone. Hey, yeah. All right. Maybe that'll do it. All right. We're going to call that good for now. Hey, Cam Wiggins. So I am going to read from The Sandman. This is a 200-year-old story, and it's part 2. So if you missed the first part, check it out. Backtrack. We've been hearing the tale of Clara and Nathaniel, and been a little bit of a wild ride so far. Let's see where we have to go. Quite indignant that Clara did not admit the demon's existence outside his own mind, Nathaniel would then come out with all the mystical doctrine of devils and powers of evil. But Clara would break off peevishly by introducing some indifferent matter, to the no small annoyance of Nathaniel. He thought that such deep secrets were closed to cold, unreceptive minds, without being clearly aware that he was counting Clara among those subordinate natures, and therefore he constantly endeavored to initiate her into the mysteries. In the morning, when Clara was getting breakfast ready, he stood by her, reading out of all sorts of mystical books till she cried, "But dear Nathaniel, suppose I blame you as the evil principle that has a hostile effect upon my coffee? For if, to please you, I drop everything and look in your eyes while you read, my coffee will overflow into the fire, and none of you will get any breakfast." Nathaniel closed the book at once and hurried indignantly to his chamber. Once he had a remarkable forte for graceful, lively tales, which he wrote down, and to which Clara listened with the greatest delight. Now his creations were gloomy, incomprehensible, and formless, so that, although out of compassion Clara did not say so, he plainly felt how little she was interested. Nothing was more unbearable to Clara than tediousness. Her looks and words expressed mental drowsiness which she could not overcome. Nathaniel's productions were indeed very tedious. His indignation at Clara's cold, prosaic disposition constantly increased, and Clara could not overcome her dislike of Nathaniel's dark, gloomy, boring mysticism, so that they became mentally more and more estranged, without either of them perceiving it. The shape of the ugly Coppelius, as Nathaniel himself was forced to confess, was growing dimmer in his fancy, and it often cost him some pains to draw him with sufficient color in his stories, where he figured as the dread bogey of ill omen. It occurred to him, however, in the end, to make his gloomy foreboding that Coppelius would destroy his happiness, the subject of a poem. He represented himself and Clara as united by true love, but occasionally threatened by a black hand, which appeared to dart into their lives, to snatch away some new joy just as it was born. Finally, as they were standing at the altar, the hideous Coppelius appeared and touched Clara's lovely eyes. They flashed into Nathaniel's heart like bleeding sparks, scorching and burning as Coppelius caught him and flung him into a flaming, fiery circle which flew round with the swiftness of a storm, carrying him along with it, amid its roaring. The roar is like that of the hurricane, when it fiercely lashes the foaming waves, which rise up like black giants with white heads for the furious combat. But through the wild tumult he heard Clara's voice. "Can't you see me, then? Coppelius has deceived you. Those indeed were not my eyes which so burned in your breast. They were glowing drops of your own heart's blood. I have my eyes still. Only look at them." Nathaniel reflects. That is Clara, and I am hers forever. Then it seems to him as though this thought has forcibly entered the fiery circle which stands still, while the noise dully ceases in the dark abyss. Nathaniel looks into Clara's eyes, but it is death that looks kindly upon him from her eyes. While Nathaniel composed this poem, he was very calm and collected. He polished and improved every line, and having subjected himself to the fetters of meter, he did not rest till all was correct and melodious. When at last he had finished and read the poem aloud to himself, a wild horror seized him. "Whose horrible voice is that?" he cried out. Soon, however, the whole appeared to him a very successful work, and he felt that it must rouse Clara's cold temperament, although he did not clearly consider why Clara was to be excited, nor what purpose it would serve to torment her with frightful pictures threatening a horrible fate, destructive to their love. Both of them, that is to say, Nathaniel and Clara, were sitting in his mother's little garden, Clara very cheerful, because Nathaniel had not teased her with his dreams and his forebodings during the 3 days in which he had been writing his poem. He was even talking cheerfully, as in the old days, about pleasant matters, which caused Clara to remark, "Now, for the first time, I have you again. Don't you see that we have driven the ugly Coppelius away?" Not till then did it strike Nathaniel that he had in his pocket the poem which he had intended to read. He at once drew the sheets out and began, while Clara, expecting something tedious as usual, resigned herself and began quietly to knit. But as the dark cloud rose ever blacker and blacker, she let the stocking fall and looked him full in the face. He was carried irresistibly along by his poem. An internal fire deeply reddened his cheeks. Tears flowed from his eyes. At last, when he had concluded, he groaned in a state of utter exhaustion, and catching Clara's hand, sighed forth, as if melted into the most inconsolable grief, "Oh, Clara, Clara!" Clara pressed him gently to her bosom, and said softly, but very solemnly and sincerely, "Nathaniel, dearest Nathaniel, do throw that mad, senseless, insane stuff into the fire." Upon this, Nathaniel sprang up enraged, and thrusting Clara from him, cried, "Oh, inanimate, accursed automaton!" with which he ran off. Clara, deeply offended, shed bitter tears and sobbed aloud, "Ah, he has never loved me, for he does not understand me." Lothair entered the arbor. Clara was obliged to tell him all that had occurred. He loved his sister with all his soul, and every word of her complaint fell like a spark of fire into his heart, so that the indignation which he had long harbored against the visionary Nathaniel now broke out into the wildest rage. He ran to Nathaniel and reproached him for his senseless conduct toward his beloved sister in hard words, to which the infuriated Nathaniel reported in the same style. The appellation of fantastical mad fool was answered by that of miserable commonplace fellow. A duel was inevitable. They agreed on the following morning, according to the local student custom, to fight with sharp rapiers on the far side of the garden. Silently and gloomily they slunk about. Clara had overheard the violent dispute, and seeing the fencing master bring the rapiers at dawn, guessed what was to occur. Having reached the place of combat, Lothair and Nathaniel had in gloomy silence flung off their coats, and with the lust of battle in their flaming eyes were about to fall upon one another, when Clara rushed through the garden door, crying aloud between her sobs, "You wild, cruel men, strike me down before you attack each other. For how can I live on if my lover murders my brother, or my brother murders my lover?" Lothair lowered his weapon and looked in silence on the ground, but in Nathaniel's heart, amid the most poignant sorrow, there revived all his love for the beautiful Clara, which he had felt in the prime of his happy youth. The weapon fell from his hand. He threw himself at Clara's feet. "Can you ever forgive me, my only, my beloved Clara? Can you forgive me, my dear brother Lothair?" Lothair was touched by the deep contrition of his friend. All three embraced in reconciliation and amid 1,000 tears, and vowed eternal love and fidelity. Nathaniel felt as though a heavy and oppressive burden had been rolled away, as though by resisting the dark power that held him fast he had saved his whole being, which had been threatened with annihilation. 3 happy days he passed with his dear friends, and then went to G, where he intended to stay a year, and then to return to his native town forever. All that referred to Coppelius was kept a secret from his mother, for it was well known that she could not think of him without terror, since she, as well as Nathaniel, held him guilty of causing her husband's death. How surprised was Nathaniel when, proceeding to his lodgings, he saw that the whole house was burned down, and that only the bare walls stood up amid the ashes. However, although fire had broken out in the laboratory of the apothecary who lived on the ground floor, and had therefore consumed the house from top to bottom, some bold, active friends had succeeded in entering Nathaniel's room in the upper story in time to save his books, manuscripts, and instruments. They carried all safe and sound into another house, where they took a room, to which Nathaniel moved at once. He did not think it at all remarkable that he now lodged opposite to Professor Spallanzani. Neither did it appear singular when he perceived that his window looked straight into the room where Olympia often sat alone, so that he could plainly recognize her figure, although the features of her face were indistinct and confused. At last it struck him that Olympia often remained for hours in that attitude in which he had once seen her through the glass door, sitting at a little table without any occupation, and that she was plainly enough looking over at him with an unvarying gaze. He was forced to confess that he had never seen a more lovely form, but with Clara in his heart, the stiff Olympia was perfectly indifferent to him. Occasionally, to be sure, he gave a transient look over his textbook at the beautiful statue, but that was all. He was just writing to Clara when he heard a light tap at the door. It stopped as he answered, and the repulsive face of Coppola peeped in. Nathaniel's heart trembled within him, but remembering what Spallanzani had told him about his compatriot Coppola, and also the firm promise he had made to Clara with respect to the Sandman Coppelius, he felt ashamed of his childish fear, and, collecting himself with all his might, said as softly and civilly as possible, "I do not want a barometer, my good friend. Pray go." Upon this, Coppola advanced a good way into the room, his wide mouth distorted into a hideous laugh, and his little eyes darting fire from beneath their long gray lashes. No barometer, no barometer," he said in a hoarse voice. "I have pretty eyes, too, pretty eyes." "Madman!" cried Nathaniel in horror. "How can you have eyes? Eyes?" But Coppola had already put his barometer aside and plunged his hand into his wide coat pocket, whence he drew lorgnettes and spectacles, which he placed upon the table. There, spectacles on the nose, those are my eyes, pretty eyes," he gabbled, drawing out more and more spectacles until the whole table began to glisten and sparkle in the most extraordinary manner. 1,000 eyes stared and quivered, their gaze fixed upon Nathaniel, yet he could not look away from the table where Coppola kept laying down still more and more spectacles, and all those flaming eyes leapt in wilder and wilder confusion, shooting their blood-red light into Nathaniel's heart. At last, overwhelmed with horror, he shrieked out, "Stop, stop, you terrify me," and seized Coppola by the arm, as he searched his pockets to bring out still more spectacles, although the whole table was already covered. Coppola gently extricated himself with a hoarse, repulsive laugh, and with the words, "Nothing for you, but here are pretty glasses," collected all the spectacles, packed them away, and from the breast pocket of his coat drew forth a number of telescopes, large and small. As soon as the spectacles were removed, Nathaniel felt quite easy, and, thinking of Clara, perceived that the hideous phantom was but the creature of his own mind, that this Coppola was an honest optician, and could not possibly be the accursed double of Coppelius. Moreover, in all the glasses which Coppola now placed on the tables, there was nothing remarkable, or at least nothing so uncanny as in the spectacles, and to set matters right, Nathaniel resolved to make a purchase. He took up a little, very neatly constructed pocket telescope and looked through the window to try it. Never in his life had he met a glass which brought objects so clearly and sharply before his eyes. Involuntarily, he looked into Spallanzani's room. Olympia was sitting as usual before the little table with her arms laid upon it and her hands folded. For the first time he could see the wondrous beauty in the shape of her face. Only her eyes seemed to him singularly still and dead. Nevertheless, as he looked more keenly through the glass, it seemed to him as if moist moonbeams were rising in Olympia's eyes. It was as if the power of seeing were being kindled for the first time. Her glances flashed with constantly increasing life. As if spellbound, Nathaniel reclined against the window, meditating on the charming Olympia. A humming and scraping aroused him as if from a dream. Coppola was standing behind him. 3 zucchini, 3 ducats. He had quite forgotten the optician, and quickly paid him what he asked. "Is it not so? A pretty glass, asked Coppola in his hoarse, repulsive voice, and with his malicious smile. Yes, replied Nathaniel peevishly. Goodbye, friend." Coppola left the room, but not without casting many strange glances at Nathaniel. He heard him laugh loudly on the stairs. "Ah," thought Nathaniel, "he is laughing at me because no doubt I have paid him too much for this little glass." While he softly uttered these words, it seemed as if a deep and lugubrious sigh were sounding fearfully through the room, and his breath was stopped by inward anguish. He perceived, however, that it was himself that had sighed. Clara is right, he said to himself, in taking me for a senseless dreamer, but it is pure madness, nay, more than madness, that the stupid thought of having paid Coppola too much for the glass still pains me so strangely. I cannot see the cause. He now sat down to finish his letter to Clara, but a glance through the window assured him that Olympia was still sitting there, and he instantly sprang up, as if impelled by an irresistible power, seized Coppola's glass, and could not tear himself away from the seductive sight of Olympia, till his friend and brother Sigismund called him to go to Professor Spallanzani's lecture. The curtain was drawn close before the fatal room, and he could see Olympia no longer, nor could he upon the next day or the next, although he scarcely ever left his window, and constantly looked through Coppola's glass. On the third day, the windows were completely covered. In utter despair, filled with a longing and a burning desire, he ran out of the town gate. Olympia's form floated before him in the air, stepped forth from the bushes, and peeped at him with large beaming eyes from the clear brook. Clara's image had completely vanished from his mind. He thought of nothing but Olympia, and complained aloud in a murmuring voice, "Ah, noble, sublime star of my love! Have you only risen upon me to vanish immediately and leave me in dark, hopeless night?" As he returned to his lodging, however, he perceived a great bustle in Spallanzani's house. The doors were wide open, all sorts of utensils were being carried in, the windows of the first floor were being taken out, maidservants were going about sweeping and dusting with great hair brooms, and carpenters and upholsterers were knocking and hammering within. Nathaniel remained standing in the street in a state of perfect wonder, when Sigismund came up to him laughing and said, "Now, what do you say to our old Spallanzani?" Nathaniel assured him that he could say nothing because he knew nothing about the professor, but on the contrary perceived with astonishment the mad proceedings in a house otherwise so quiet and gloomy. He then learnt from Sigismund that Spallanzani intended to give a grand party on the following day, a concert and ball, and that half the university was invited. It was generally reported that Spallanzani, who had so long kept his daughter most scrupulously from every human eye, would now let her appear for the first time. Nathaniel found a card of invitation, and with heart beating high went at the appointed hour to the professor's, where the coaches were already arriving and the lights shining in the decorated rooms. The company was numerous and brilliant. Olympia appeared dressed with great richness and taste. Her beautifully shaped face and her figure roused general admiration. The somewhat strange arch of her back and the wasp-like thinness of her waist seemed to be produced by too tight lacing. In her step and deportment there was something measured and stiff, which struck many as unpleasant, but it was ascribed to the constraint produced by the company. The concert began. Olympia played the harpsichord with great dexterity and sang a virtuoso piece with a voice like the sound of a glass bell, clear and almost piercing. Nathaniel was quite enraptured. He stood in the back row and could not perfectly recognize Olympia's features in the dazzling light. Therefore, quite unnoticed, he took out Coppola's glass and looked towards the fair creature. Ah, then he saw with what a longing glance she gazed towards him, and how every note of her song plainly sprang from that loving glance, whose fire penetrated his inmost soul. Her accomplished roulades seemed to Nathaniel the exultation of a mind transfigured by love, and when at last, after the cadence, the long trill sounded shrilly through the room, he felt as if clutched by burning arms. He could restrain himself no longer, but with mingled pain and rapture shouted out, "Olympia!" Everyone looked at him, and many laughed. The organist of the cathedral made a gloomier face than usual and simply said, "Well, well." The concert had finished. The ball began. To dance with her, with her! That was the aim of all Nathaniel's desire, of all his efforts. But how to gain courage to ask her, the queen of the ball? Nevertheless, he himself did not know how it happened. No sooner had the dancing begun than he was standing close to Olympia, who had not yet been asked to dance. Scarcely able to stammer out a few words, he had seized her hand. Olympia's hand was as cold as ice. He felt a horrible, deathly chill thrilling through him. He looked into her eyes, which beamed back full of love and desire, and at the same time, it seemed as though her pulse began to beat, and her life's blood to flow into her cold hand. And in the soul of Nathaniel, the joy of love rose still higher. He clasped the beautiful Olympia, and with her flew through the dance. He thought that his dancing was usually correct as to time, but the peculiarly steady rhythm with which Olympia moved, and which often put him completely out, soon showed him that his time was most defective. However, he would dance with no other lady, and would have murdered anyone who approached Olympia for the purpose of asking her. But this only happened twice, and to his astonishment Olympia remained seated until the next dance, when he lost no time in making her rise again. Had he been able to see any other object beside the fair Olympia, all sorts of unfortunate quarrels would have been inevitable, for the quiet, scarcely suppressed laughter which arose among the young people in every corner was manifestly directed toward Olympia, whom they followed with very curious glances. One could not tell why. Heated by the dance and by the wine of which he had freely partaken, Nathaniel had laid aside all his ordinary reserve. He sat by Olympia with her hand in his, and, in a high state of inspiration, told her his passion in words which neither he nor Olympia understood. Yet perhaps she did, for she looked steadfastly into his face and sighed several times. Ah, upon this Nathaniel said, "O splendid heavenly lady, ray from the promised land of love, deep soul in whom all my being is reflected," with much more stuff of the like kind. But Olympia merely went on sighing, ah. Professor Spallanzani occasionally passed the happy pair and smiled on them with a look of singular satisfaction. To Nathaniel, although he felt in quite another world, it seemed suddenly as though Professor Spallanzani's face was growing considerably darker, and when he looked around he perceived to his no small horror that the last 2 candles in the empty room had burned down to their sockets and were just going out. The music and dancing had ceased long ago. "Parting, parting," he cried in wild despair. He kissed Olympia's hand. He bent towards her mouth, when his glowing lips were met by lips cold as ice. Just as when he had touched her cold hand, he felt himself overcome by horror. The legend of the dead bride darted suddenly through his mind, but Olympia pressed him fast, and her lips seemed to spring to life at his kiss. Professor Spallanzani strode through the empty hall. His steps caused a hollow echo, and his figure, round which a flickering shadow played, had a fearful spectral appearance. "Do you love me? Do you love me, Olympia? Only one word. Do you love me?" whispered Nathaniel. But as she rose, Olympia only sighed, "Ah. "Yes, my gracious, my beautiful star of love," said Nathaniel. "You have risen upon me, and you will shine, forever lighting my inmost soul." Ah, replied Olympia as she departed. Nathaniel followed her. They both stood before the professor. "You've had a very animated conversation with my daughter," said he, smiling. "So, dear Herr Nathaniel, if you have any pleasure in talking with a silly girl, your visits shall be welcome." Nathaniel departed with a whole heaven beaming in his heart. The next day Spallanzani's party was the general subject of conversation, notwithstanding that the professor had made every effort to appear splendid. The wags had all sorts of incongruities and oddities to talk about. They were particularly hard upon the dumb, stiff Olympia, whom, in spite of her beautiful exterior, they considered to be completely stupid, and they were delighted to find in her stupidity the reason why Spallanzani had kept her so long concealed. Nathaniel did not hear this without secret anger. Nevertheless, he held his peace. For, thought he, is it worthwhile convincing these fellows that it is their own stupidity that prevents their recognizing Olympia's deep, noble mind? One day Sigismund said to him, "Be kind enough, brother, to tell me how a sensible fellow like you could possibly lose your head over that wax face, over that wooden doll up there." Nathaniel was about to fly out in a passion, but he quickly recollected himself and retorted, "Tell me, Sigmund, how it is that Olympia's heavenly charms could escape your active and intelligent eyes, which generally perceive things so clearly. But for that very reason, heaven be thanked, I have not you for my rival. Otherwise, one of us must have fallen a bleeding corpse. Sigismund plainly perceived his friend's condition, so he skillfully gave the conversation a turn, and after observing that in love affairs there was no disputing about the object, added, "Nevertheless, it is strange that many of us think much the same about Olympia. To us, pray do not take it ill, brother. She appears singularly stiff and soulless. Her shape is well proportioned, so is her face, that is true. She might pass for beautiful if her glance were not so utterly without a ray of life, without the power of vision. Her pace is strangely regular. Every movement seems to depend on some wound-up clockwork. Her playing and her singing keep the same unpleasantly correct and spiritless time as a musical box, and the same may be said of her dancing. We find your Olympia quite uncanny and prefer to have nothing to do with her. She seems to act like a living being and yet has some strange peculiarity of her own." Nathaniel did not completely yield to the bitter feeling which these words of Sigismund's roused in him, but mastered his indignation, and merely said with great earnestness, "Olympia may appear uncanny to you, cold, prosaic man. Only the poetical mind is sensitive to its like in others. To me alone was the love in her glances revealed, and it has pierced my mind and all my thought. Only in the love of Olympia do I discover my real self. It may not suit you that she does not indulge in idle chit-chat like other shallow minds. She utters few words, it is true, but these few words appear as genuine hieroglyphs of the inner world, full of love and deep knowledge of the spiritual life and contemplation of the eternal beyond. But you have no sense for all this, and my words are wasted on you." "God preserve you, brother," said Sigismund very mildly, almost sorrowfully. "But you seem to me to be in an evil way. You may depend upon me if all... No, I will not say anything further." All of a sudden it struck Nathaniel that the cold, prosaic Sigismund meant very well towards him. He therefore shook his proffered hand very heartily. Nathaniel had totally forgotten the very existence of Clara, whom he had once loved. His mother, Lothair, all had vanished from his memory. He lived only for Olympia, with whom he sat for hours every day, uttering strange, fantastical stuff about his love, about the sympathy that glowed to life, about the affinity of souls, to all of which Olympia listened with great devotion. From the very bottom of his desk he drew out all that he had ever written, poems, fantasies, visions, romances, tales. This stock was daily increased by all sorts of extravagant sonnets, stanzas, and canzoni, and he read them all tirelessly to Olympia for hours on end. Never had he known such an admirable listener. She neither embroidered nor knitted. She never looked out of the window. She fed no favorite bird. She played neither with lapdog nor pet cat. She did not twist a slip of paper or anything else in her hand. She was not obliged to suppress a yawn by a gentle forced cough. In short, she sat for hours, looking straight into her lover's eyes, without stirring, and her glance became more and more lively and animated only when Nathaniel rose at last and kissed her hand, and her lips did say, "Ah, ah," to which she added, "Good night, dearest." "Oh, deep, noble mind," cried Nathaniel in his own room, you alone, dear one, fully understand me." He trembled with inward rapture when he considered the wonderful harmony that was revealed more and more every day between his own mind and that of Olympia. For it seemed to him as if Olympia had spoken concerning him and his poetical talent out of the depths of his own mind, as if her voice had actually sounded from within himself. That must indeed have been the case, for Olympia never uttered any words whatever beyond those which have already been recorded. Even when Nathaniel, in clear and sober moments, as for instance upon waking in the morning, remembered Olympia's utter passivity and her painful lack of words, he merely said, "Words, words. The glance of her heavenly eye speaks more than any language here below. Can a child of heaven adapt herself to the narrow confines drawn by a miserable mundane necessity?" Professor Spallanzani appeared highly delighted at the intimacy between his daughter and Nathaniel. To the latter he gave the most unequivocal signs of approbation. And when Nathaniel ventured at last to hint at a union with Olympia, his whole face smiled as he observed that he would leave his daughter a free choice in the matter. Encouraged by these words, and with burning passion in his heart, Nathaniel resolved to implore Olympia on the very next day to say directly and in plain words what her kind glance had told him long ago, namely that she loved him. He sought the ring which his mother had given him at parting, to give it to Olympia as a symbol of his devotion, of his life which budded forth and bloomed with her alone. Clara's letters and Lothaire's came to his hands during the search, but he flung them aside indifferently, found the ring, pocketed it, and hastened over to Olympia. Already on the steps in the hall he heard a strange noise which seemed to proceed from Spallanzani's room. There was a stamping, a clattering, a pushing, a banging against the door, intermingled with curses and imprecations. Let go! Let go! A rascal! A scoundrel! Body and soul I've risked upon it. Ha ha ha! That's not what we agreed to. I made the eyes. I made the clockwork. Stupid blockhead with your clockwork. Accursed dog of a bungling watchmaker. Or with you, devil, stop. Pipe maker. Infernal beast. Stop. Get out. Let go. These words were uttered by the voices of Spallanzani and the hideous Coppelius, who were raging and wrangling together. Nathaniel rushed in, overcome by the most inexpressible anguish. The professor was holding a female figure fast by the shoulders. The Italian Coppola grasped it by the feet, and there they were, tugging and pulling, this way and that, contending for the possession of it with the utmost fury. Nathaniel started back with horror, when in the figure he recognized Olympia. Boiling with the wildest indignation, he was about to rescue his beloved from these infuriated men. But at that moment, Coppola, whirling round with the strength of a giant, wrenched the figure from the professor's hand and then dealt him a tremendous blow with the object itself, which sent him reeling and tumbling backwards over the table, upon which stood vials, retorts, bottles, and glass cylinders. All these were dashed to 1,000 shivers. Now, Coppola flung the figure across his shoulders, and with a frightful burst of shrill laughter dashed down the stairs, so fast that the feet of the figure, which dangled in the most hideous manner, rattled with a wooden sound on every step. Nathaniel stood paralyzed. He had seen, but too plainly, that Olympia's waxen, deathly pale countenance had no eyes, but black holes instead. She was indeed a lifeless doll. Spallanzani was writhing on the floor. The pieces of glass had cut his head, his breast, and his arms, and the blood was spurting up as from so many fountains. But he soon collected all his strength. After him! What are you waiting for? Coppelius has robbed me of my best automaton. A work of 20 years, body and soul risked upon it. The clockwork, the speech, the walk, mine. The eyes stolen from you. The infernal rascal. After him! Fetch Olympia. There you see the eyes. And now Nathaniel saw that a pair of eyes lay upon the ground, staring at him. These Spallanzani caught up, with his unwounded hand, and flung into his bosom. Then madness seized Nathaniel in its burning claws and clutched his very soul, destroying his every sense and thought. Ho, 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 a circle of fire, spin round, circle, merrily, merrily, ho, wooden doll, spin round, pretty doll, he cried, flying at the professor and clutching at his throat. He would have strangled him had not the noise attracted a crowd, who rushed in and forced Nathaniel to let go, thus saving the professor, whose wounds were immediately dressed. Sigismund, strong as he was not able to master the mad Nathaniel, who kept crying out in a frightening voice, "Spin round, wooden doll!" and laid about him with clenched fists. At last the combined force of many succeeded in overcoming him, in flinging him to the ground and binding him. His words were merged into one hideous roar like that of a brute, and in this insane condition he was taken, raging, to the madhouse. Before I proceed to tell you, gentle reader, what more befell the unfortunate Nathaniel, should you by chance take an interest in that skillful optician and automaton maker Spallanzani, I can inform you that he was completely healed of his wounds. He was, however, obliged to leave the university because Nathaniel's story had created a sensation, and it was universally considered a quite unpardonable trick to smuggle a wooden doll into respectable tea parties in space of a living person. For Olympia had been quite a success at tea parties. The lawyers called it a most subtle deception, and the more culpable, inasmuch as he had planned it so artfully against the public that not a single soul, a few cunning students excepted, had detected it, although all now wished to play the wiseacre and referred to various facts which had appeared to them suspicious. Nothing very clever was revealed in this way. Would it strike anyone as so very suspicious, for instance, that according to the expression of an elegant teaite, Olympia had, contrary to all usage, sneezed oftener than she had yawned? The former, remarked this fashionable person, was the sound of the concealed clockwork winding itself up. Moreover, it had creaked audibly, and so on. The professor of poetry and eloquence took a pinch of snuff, clapped the lid of his box to, cleared his throat, and said solemnly, "Ladies and gentlemen, do you not perceive where the trick lies? It is all an allegory, a sustained metaphor, you understand me, sapient, sat." But many were not satisfied with this. The story of the automaton had struck deep root into their souls, and in fact a pernicious mistrust of human figures in general had begun to creep in. Many lovers, to be quite convinced that they were not enamored of wooden dolls, would request their mistresses to sing and dance a little out of time, to embroider and knit and play with their lapdogs while listening to reading, etc., and above all, not merely to listen, but also sometimes to talk, in such a manner as presupposed actual thought and feeling. With many, the bond of love became firmer and more entrancing, though others, on the contrary, slipped gently out of the noose. "One cannot really answer for this," said some. At tea parties, yawning prevailed to an incredible extent, and there was no sneezing at all, that all suspicion might be avoided. Spallanzani, as already stated, was obliged to decamp, to escape a criminal prosecution for fraudulently introducing an automaton into human society. Coppola had vanished also. Nathaniel awakened as from a heavy, frightful dream. As he opened his eyes, he felt an indescribable sensation of pleasure glowing through him with heavenly warmth. He was in bed, in his own room, in his father's house. Clara was stooping over him, and Lothair and his mother were standing near. At last, beloved Nathaniel, you have recovered from your serious illness. Now you are mine again," said Clara, from the very depth of her soul, and clasped Nathaniel in her arms. It was with mingled sorrow and delight that the bright tears fell from his eyes as he answered with a deep sigh, my own Clara." Sigismund, who had faithfully remained with his friend in his hour of trouble, now entered. Nathaniel stretched out his hand to him. "And you, faithful brother, have you not deserted me?" Every trace of Nathaniel's madness had vanished, and he soon gained strength under the care of his mother, his beloved, and his friends. Good fortune also had visited the house, for a miserly old uncle, of whom nothing had been expected, had died, leaving their mother, besides considerable property, an estate in a pleasant spot near the town. Thither Nathaniel decided to go with his Clara, whom he now intended to marry. His mother and Lothair. He had grown milder and more docile than ever he had been before, and now for the first time he understood the heavenly purity and the greatness of Clara's mind. No one, by the slightest hint, reminded him of the past. Only when Sigismund took leave of him, Nathaniel said, "Heavens, brother, I was in an evil way, but a good angel led me betimes onto the path of light. Ah, that was Clara." Sigismund did not let him carry the discourse further for fear that grievous recollections might burst forth in all their lurid brightness. At about this time, the 4 lucky persons thought of going to the estate. It was noon, and they were walking in the streets of the city where they had made several purchases. The high steeple of the town hall was already casting its gigantic shadow over the marketplace. "Oh," said Clara, "let us climb it once more and look out at the distant mountains." No sooner said than done. Nathaniel and Clara both ascended the steps. The mother returned home with the servants, and Lothair, who was not inclined to clamber up so many stairs, chose to remain below. The 2 lovers stood arm in arm on the highest gallery of the tower, and looked down upon the misty forests, behind which the blue mountains rose like a gigantic city. "Look there at that curious little gray bush," said Clara. "It actually looks as if it were striding towards us." Nathaniel mechanically put his hand into his breast pocket. He found Coppola's telescope, and pointed it to one side. Clara was in the way of the glass. His pulse and veins leapt compulsively. Pale as death, he stared at Clara. Soon streams of fire flashed and glared from his rolling eyes. He roared frightfully, like a hunted beast. Then he sprang high into the air, and, punctuating his words with horrible laughter, he shrieked out in a piercing tone, "Spin round, wooden doll, spin round!" Then, seizing Clara with immense force, he tried to hurl her down. But with the desperate strength of one battling against death, she clutched the railings. Lothair heard the raging of the madman. He heard Clara's shriek of agony. Fearful forebodings darted through his mind. He ran up. The door to the second flight was fastened. Clara's shrieks became louder and still louder. Frantic with rage and anxiety, he threw himself against the door, which finally burst open. Clara's voice was becoming weaker and weaker. "Help! Help! Save me!" With these words, the voice seemed to die on the air. "She's gone, murdered by that madman!" cried Lothair. The door of the gallery was also closed, but despair gave him a giant's strength, and he burst it from the hinges. Heavens! Grasped by the mad Nathaniel, Clara was hanging in the air over the gallery. With one hand only, she still held one of the iron railings. Quick as lightning, Lothair caught his sister and drew her in, at the same moment striking the madman in the face with his clenched fist to such effect that he reeled and let go his prey. Lothair ran down with his fainting sister in his arms. She was saved. Nathaniel went raging about the gallery, leaping high in the air and crying, "Circle of fire, spin round, spin round!" The people collected at the sound of his wild shrieks, and among them, prominent for his gigantic stature, was the advocate Coppelius, who had just come to the town and was proceeding straight to the marketplace. Some wished to climb up and secure the madman, but Coppelius only laughed, saying, "Ha, ha, just wait. He will soon come down of his own accord," and looked up like the rest. Nathaniel suddenly stood still as if petrified. Then, perceiving Coppelius, he stooped down and yelled out, "Ah, pretty eyes, pretty eyes," with which he sprang over the railing. When Nathaniel lay on the stone pavement with his head shattered, Coppelius had disappeared in the crowd. Many years afterwards, it is said that Clara was seen in a remote spot, sitting hand in hand with a kind-looking man before the door of a country house, while 2 lively boys played before her. From this it may be inferred that she at last found a quiet domestic happiness suitable to her serene and cheerful nature, a happiness which the morbid Nathaniel would never have given her. You've been listening to the 200-year-old yarn, The Sandman, by E.T.A. Hoffmann. Thanks for coming around. What a grand time it's been. I think tomorrow night we're going to get into the great god Pan, which will probably take a similar span of 2 or 3 nights. be well and be good to one another.